So we now have all the pieces that we need to submit the form, to allow the user to fill in their email address, their password, maybe their confirmation of the password if they are in registration mode, and then finally to click the button down here, which is going to represent the form submission. Now, we don't have any kind of backend for this app, so we're not going to actually do a real form submission, but we're going to walk through as much of the process as we can. Basically, what we're going to do on the front end is just perform some basic logical checks. For example, if the user has given us an email address and a password in login mode, we're going to give them a message that says they're successfully logged in when they click this button. And similarly, if they are in registration mode and they give us these 3 fields and they click the register button, we're going to give them a message that says that registration has been successfully completed. Again, in the real world, you would typically reach out to the backend where you'd actually create the user in the database or create the session in the database, etc. But we don't have a backend component, so we're just going to pretend or mock out that occurrence since we're focusing strictly on the React side of things. With that said, in order to submit this form, there's 2 things we're going to need to do. The first is I'm going to go down to our button component right here, and we wired up a new prop called type in a couple lessons ago, and we're going to use that type prop right now, which will be eventually delegated down to the button HTML element in the button component, and I'm going to give it a type of submit. So just as a quick reminder right here, this type is available as a prop right here in the render method of our button component, and it's passed down directly to the type attribute of this button element right here. And the way this works is if we have a button with a type attribute set to submit within a form, clicking that button will represent the form submission. That's what will actually trigger the form submission. Okay, now in order to react to that form submission, that is going to be an event, right? It's an occurrence. It's something that occurs at a specific moment in time, in this case, whenever the user clicks on this button. So in order to react to that form submission event, we're actually going to add a handler to this form element right here, because this is the actual form that encapsulates everything the user is completing. So earlier on in the course, we talked about events in React, and we talked about the syntax that we do, which is we write the event name. It's usually going to be the on keyword followed by the event name, and then we provide either a function in line or a method that React will invoke when that event occurs. So one classic example is onClick. We write the onClick attribute name on a button, for example, and we provide a function to run when the user clicks on a button. Another example that we have right here in our file is the onChange handler for an input. Whenever the user types a character, this is what React is going to run for us. The exact same rules are going to apply right here. So the event name that I want to target here is going to be submission, and the name we provide here is onSubmit. And here, of course, we can provide either an inline arrow function, or we can provide a method on our component, once again, that React will invoke whenever the form is submitted. So I'm just going to call that method handle form submit. So I'm going to write this.handle form submit. That method does not exist yet, but don't worry, we're going to write it in just a second. So I'm going to scroll up, and right here I'm going to define that instance method called handle form submit. And as always, whenever we have an event occur, React will create that event object that stores metadata about the event that just transpired, and it's going to pass it in as the first argument and the only argument to whatever function or method we give to that onSubmit prop, right? So right here, I'm once again going to have a method. React is once again going to give me an event object, and this object is going to be very important in just a moment. And here is where we define our logic for what to do when the form is submitted. Now, I just want to show you that we're going to have a very interesting thing happen if we submit the form currently. There's no actual logic written yet in handle form submit, but that's totally fine because our example should still work. So I'm going to save this file. And here in our browser, I'm going to fill out some random information here like zebra@test.com. I'm going to do a sample password like test, another sample password like test. And when I click the register button, remember that we now have the type of submit added on to the button, which means that will trigger this actual form submission event. The clicking of this button will trigger this onSubmit event, which should, of course, trigger the handle form submit method. But you'll notice when I click register, something interesting happens, and that is that we lose all the content here that we previously had in those 3 fields. So what is going on here? Well, you might not have noticed it, but the page actually refreshed. All right. So let me show you one more time. If I just fill out really anything here, it's going to put in a bunch of gibberish and click register. Notice at the very top, if you look at the tab, that it quickly refreshes. So what we're actually seeing is a brand new reloaded app. The page kind of reloads from scratch and loads the React app. And since the component is being mounted again for the first time on page reload, we go back to this initial state, and that's where the form starts out. So we lose all of that work. So why is this happening? Well, this goes back to the way that forms traditionally work in browsers even before React existed. Typically, when you submit a form, you have a page refresh or at least a page navigation to some other page, right? That is the way that forms have worked since browsers came out. Unfortunately, that's not the paradigm that we're working in right now within the React ecosystem. React is an example of a single page application library. The intent here is that the user is going to load a bundle of JavaScript, and that bundle of JavaScript is going to handle all page changes moving forward. So in a perfect world, we should never have to refresh the page because we have all the content we need in that React bundle to add elements to the screen, to remove elements from the screen, to update elements, etc. So what we have here is basically a conflict between the way that forms traditionally work in browsers versus the paradigm of the React library. So what we want to do here is basically prevent the form's default behavior of triggering a page refresh. Typically, the way this is going to work in React is we're going to prevent the browser from doing the refresh that it wants, but then after we do that, we're going to perform whatever logic that form submission was supposed to perform in the first place. So for example, in the real world, if you wanted to make a request to a backend to log the user in, you would still make that request, but you would do it asynchronously with something like, an AJAX request, a regular asynchronous request to the backend that says, here's the email address, here's the password, verify the user and log them in. But we want to do this without any actual page refresh, okay? So the way we're going to do this is on the event object that we have being passed into our event handler, this event object that is generated by React, there is a method available on it called preventDefault. And the reason it has that name is because it is preventing the default behavior, which is the form refreshing the page. More specifically, the form submission refreshing the page. So whenever you look at React code bases and any method that is responsible for handling a form submission, you're going to see this pattern, which is basically the very first line in that method is typically going to be calling preventDefault on the event object, which is going to stop that traditional behavior. So now our form will not submit, our form will not redirect, our form will not cause a page refresh. And here, after we've prevented that behavior, we're going to do our actual form submission logic here, whatever that is for our app, right? So just to show you that this solves the problem, I'm going to save this. And now I can show you that if I fill in a whole bunch of gibberish here, and right here, and right here, and I click register, right? Nothing has happened because we haven't wired up any form submission logic here. However, notice that we haven't lost the data, we haven't lost the input fields, and that's because we haven't refreshed the page, which means that this logic is successfully working. It's preventing the default behavior of the form, which is the page refresh. All right, so now that we've done that, in the very next lesson, we can actually wire up a little bit of logic here, just do some basic checks that the user has given us an email address, a password, a confirmation password if they are in registration mode, and then output a message telling them their login status or their registration status. So we're gonna wrap things up in the very next lesson, and I'll see you there.